Good. Well,
All right.
we are rolling. My guy would probably like me to use a clapperboard because you've got a separate.
Do
Oh,
that.
that'll do it. You've got a separate sound there. Good man. Why
Yep.
did I never think of using my hands?
Oh, I did it for years because I was out doing videography work with people. So I learned, yeah, you can just use your hands. You don't have to. We actually bought a clapperboard, and the goddamn thing broke twice. So,
I one Rex sent me one, and so we used that. But it really never dawned on me that it's that simple. You just make a noise that's loud on both
exactly.
of them, and it'll do it. So there
That's
you go. I'm now learning professional skills from my wonderful guest, Chris Shelton, my very dear friend, Chris Shelton. How are you today, Chris?
I'm all right. I'm doing pretty good. The wife is a little under the weather, so things are always a little not so great when that's happening, but she'll bounce back. So otherwise, things are not too bad. All
Good.
things considered in this crazy world right now.
And I mean, in my experience in relationship is very much in a good relationship, you keep each other bouncing back. And from what I know of you, I'm sure that's what happens in your household.
Very much so.
I, I wanted to this is about our 54th conversation on
Right?
the record by now. I don't know where we are now. But everybody who looks at my stuff knows that I've been having a big thing about Erich Fromm for the last few months.
You have. You've name dropped him quite a bit.
I've read 5 of his books in the last 6 or 7 months because I read The Art of Loving 30 years ago. I came back to it last year, having read another of his books, Escape from Freedom, before that. And there were my notes from 30 years ago. I couldn't deny that I'd read this book. It was very closely annotated, little asterisks and lines and things like this. And I thought I'd come to my opinion of the world on my own. But 30 years later, reading this book, it's like, well, I agree with most of the things he says, and I've never
Right.
seen anybody else express them. But it somehow crept into my mind. This is a book called Man for Himself. It was the second book he wrote, published in 1947. Escape from Freedom was published in 1941. That's about how he thinks that Nazism took over. He's weird because he's a social psychologist who becomes a psychoanalyst. So he, I think, had a doctorate in social psychology before he studied analysis in 1929 in Berlin. That's a little fact for the children for their exams at the end of this. There will be a test to see how knowledgeable you are about the dates in Erich Fromm's life, which is important knowledge. But this is Man for Himself. He says it's about ethics and psychology, and he says he feels that psychology has lost ethics, and it has to have a grounding in ethics. And he then starts talking about authoritarianism. Suddenly at page 111. Now, and this is what he says. The duty of recognizing the authority's superiority results in several prohibitions. The most comprehensive of these is the taboo against feeling oneself to be or ever able to become like the authority. For this would contradict the latter's unqualified superiority and uniqueness. There is only one source, remember that. One founder, one Commodore. The real sin of Adam and Eve is, as has been pointed out before, the attempt to become like God. And it is as a punishment for this challenge and simultaneously as deterrence of a repetition of it that they are expelled from the Garden of Eden. No more apples for you, Adam and Eve. In authoritarian systems, the authority is made out to be fundamentally different from his subjects. He has powers not attainable by anyone else, magic, wisdom, strength, which can never be matched by his subjects. Whatever the authority's prerogatives are, whether he is the master of the universe or a unique leader sent by fate, the fundamental inequality between him and man is the basic tenet of authoritarian conscience. One particularly important aspect of the uniqueness of the authority is the privilege of being the only one who does not follow another's will, but who himself wills, who is not a means but an end in himself, who creates and is not created. In the authoritarian orientation, the power of will and creation are the privilege of the authority. So no creativity unless, it fits with the rules. Those subject to him are means to his end and consequently his property and used by him for his own purposes. The supremacy of the authority is questioned by the attempt of the creature to cease being a thing and to become a creator.
Mm.
There are some thoughts to ponder upon.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last, yeah.
I can find instances or examples of fitting all of those things, those points or assertions he was making. Interesting. There's a lot to like corollaries and correlations and stuff from what he was just talking about there. As far as it's interesting how I guess according to that idea, whoever the successor is going to be a lesser being. So you have a gradually lesser and lesser and lesser being now.
Unless your name is Kim, in which case, you know,
Right.
you
That's
can be
right.
exalted to the height.
That's right. Same
Divinity.
thing. Or if you have a Dalai Lama system where it's the same guy keeps coming back, right?
Yeah, though strange when you look at the biographies of those 14 guys, how different they all were. The one I like, I think this one's the 14th. I think it's somewhere around the 11th. There was one who would stand at the top of the Patala, you know, the great big, huge complex of buildings that the Dalai Lama would live in Tibet, and pee over the edge and see who he could hit below. Now, none of the other Dalai Lamas have exhibited this particular behavior. So Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, which is who he's meant to be, seems to have different facets, let's put it that way.
Yes.
That one's quite interesting in terms of being an authoritarian, but in a nice way. You know, he's seen as one of the nice authoritarians, but he is the king. He's not simply the head of one of the three Buddhist sects. He's the king.
Right. Well, I guess he's more Doctor Who-ish then.
Yeah, that's probably the best analogy. I'd never thought of that way. So he'll be a woman next time because we've now finally. Yeah.
That's right. In fact, I remember he addressed that issue a couple of years ago. There's a quote about that and how a woman probably wouldn't be the best thing for that fit. Like it was the most sexist, I don't know, I guess the most like off that I've ever heard him say something that was not like kind of in social alignment with progressive values. It was interesting. It was an interesting statement. I didn't particularly have a big argument. It was just his opinion, but it was interesting talking about that. Anyway, as far as authoritarianism goes, I just kind of went off on a little tangent there, but
yeah, that's fascinating.
I think that, you know, you mentioned earlier the timing of when he was writing this stuff, and I think the fact that he was writing some of this or looking into researching this stuff during the, you know, height of World War II does inform the work. And because you had some of the, you know, epic authoritarians of history alive and well and thriving and doing their nastiness during that time.
He left Germany in 1933, the year that Hitler became chancellor.
Wow. So he actually saw.
Yeah, he was Jewish and also a communist at that time, though he changed his views about that, as many people did. But yeah, so he's informed by the whole rise of the Nazis, which he saw around him. He experienced that as a social psychologist.
Wow. We often wonder, a major fear, it's at least expressed as I see on social media, because this is a recurring theme. It happens again and again. Every time there's some kind of authoritarian overreach or what can be interpreted or skewed to be authoritarian overreach, whether it really is or not. And yes, there are lots of times when there is. And yes, there are lots of times when they say that's what's going on when it's not.
But they're crying wolf.
That's right. And this is media, this is progressives, this is conservatives, this is all over the board.
It's everywhere, yeah.
Yeah, we get misrepresentations. But I find, where I'm going is that I find people are very, very skittish on this in the modern world, having had so many years and decades of education and you know and true you know enlightenment about this topic, discussion about this topic. Because everybody is still, in their hearts, I think, unless they're living in some kind of weird denial, and you get those people. But I think for the most part, most people consider the events of the Holocaust and World War II as real, that they did happen, that the pictures are undeniable, the film work, everything is very, very real. And I think deep in people's hearts, they are terrified that it could happen again, and they won't see it coming. in the same way that I think a lot of people in Germany, including the Jews who were there, who were being isolated and slowly having their rights taken away, taken away, taken away. And at every point along the way, I was told, growing up as a kid, that the attitude was, this is as bad as it can get. This is as bad as it can get. It can't get any worse than this, until finally they are being marched into trains and taken to death camps. So it can always get worse until you simply are around no more. And people know that. They're not, I don't think people are as stupid as some people think they are out there about how this stuff works and how slowly incremental authoritarianism is a real threat. It's a fear because there are millions and millions of people on this planet right now who are suffering under the yoke of some form of a fascist, communist, whatever, authoritarian regimes, between China, between some of what's going on in Africa, and arguably some of what goes on in the United States, although I don't take it in anywhere near as far as some people go,
Let's come into a definition of authoritarian, because it has two significant meanings. One is somebody who believes that they should be the ruler by divine right, that they should be the boss, that they are superior to other people. That's the Hitler end, the Stalin end, the Mao end. And the other end is the people who believe they need to be led. And when you add those numbers together, the people who think they should be in charge are, 1 or 2% really in our society. And the people who believe them make up about 60%. That's Schopenhauer's estimate in the 1840s, I think it was, 60% people. It's what Milgram comes to. I think it's 62.5 or something in the first, and it declines. Thankfully, the effect does decline. But 2/3 of people, if you then connect in Erich Fromm, you see, here we go again, in his first book about Nazism, 1941, Escape from Freedom, he talks about what's happened in society is that the majority now have a pseudo-self. We talked about this a little.
Yeah, you brought this up. Tell me more about this.
Well, the idea is that as we, from birth, we're maturing, and there should come a point of maturity where we have a self. This is who I am, rather than, am I doing all right? Rather than, am I meeting your standards? Rather than some kind of, Freud called it the superego, some set of rules in your head that is dictating how you behave. So you conform and comply with these rules so that you will be rewarded, whatever. I mean, I baffled a Christian who asked me why on earth I would waste my life battling with Scientology. It's like, what kind of stupid person am I? He had an explanation for why he was doing it. He was going to go to heaven. And then I just said to him, virtue's its own reward. That's all I got. That's all I got. And it really isn't much, but
someday
I've got a little bit,
That's right.
So right. In that sense, probably about 2/3, 60% of people, half of people, I don't know, but a lot of people are going, well, I don't know, what do you think? And it's not because they're stupid, it's because that's what they've been brought up to believe. So if you look at is it Westboro Baptists, who picket funerals, calling soldiers gay and stuff. The wonderful, I think she's the granddaughter of the founder, who in the end was expelled by the sect for waving a hearty hello to the lesbian and gay alliance people over the road. They expelled the guy who founded the sect because he was suddenly being friendly towards gay people.
Interesting. Well, I know his granddaughter took off and wrote a book, and
yeah, she's fantastic. I saw her.
Megan Roper Phelps.
Yes, I saw a conversation with her. She should talk to you. You'd be good at talking to her.
I would very much like to talk with her.
That'd be a good idea. But I was very impressed with her. But then you go and look at film of the Westboro Baptists, and you see her, of course, because she's in the documentaries, and you see how far gone she was. That this was the way, the truth, and the life. Now you're looking at a very intelligent woman there, quite evidently. She can think, she can articulate, but somehow her thinking was all caught up in being part of that authoritarian sect where the truth is handed down to them. And I guess there's the problem, that whenever the truth is handed down to you and you comply with the truth you've been given without understanding why you're doing it or what it achieves, then you're not yourself. You're an, an instrument of culture. You're not an individual anymore. So there's a point of choice where you say, no, this is who I am. I buy my shirts from thrift stores because that's good for the environment and good for my bank balance. And a lot of people around here buy designer stuff and never wear it. So yeah, this is a very fancy shirt, and obviously what you're wearing there is just gorgeous. What can I say?
Wow.
Somebody actually complained on this YouTube channel about my son and I were wearing clothes from thrift stores. You go,
oh my God.
What kind of, this is a £50 shirt. What are you talking about? Of course, I squander money at, they suggested Primark, which is notorious for hiring slaves in China, but that we go there for our clothes instead. And I think there's a moral statement in that. Authoritarianism, the idea of believing something, and you with, the essential notion of critical thinking, of skepticism, that is the release, to teach people to challenge their own assumptions, to challenge their own certainty, but very definitely not to say, I'm not, the one you've heard me say it before, the guy who said to me, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true.
Right.
Going, does not compute. What?
Well, that obviously is a walking contradiction. I mean, it's clearly the case that those two things can't be true at the same time, and yet here's, the extremist believer who is positive that.
As Yuval would say, I had the experience, so I have the belief. Something happened to me, and so I now trust everything that comes from the source that taught me how to stare at somebody until I hallucinated, or stare at a wall until I hallucinated, or jump up and down until I hallucinated, or play drums until I hallucinated.
There's something about what you're talking about here, though, that I feel I need to push back on a little bit, or at least question or interrogate more.
Yeah.
So he's talking about this pseudo identity as though pseudo self. Okay, so I want to make sure I understand that, because the way I'm hearing it is you have this, as Hassan has talked about, you have this cult personality that can build up. Are we talking about that? Is that what we're making an analogy to?
No, what he's saying is that however many identities are the threads of a person, the moods they have and the people they're with and how they respond differently to their pet and their mum and their boss and what have you, those identities, which are perfectly natural, that those things have not knitted together into a self. That's what Fromm would be saying. So the person is immature. They're still directed by others in the same way that a child would be, rather than being incompetent of making their own decisions, fully competent of making their own decisions. If any of this is ever, or nearly fully, not influenced by slogans and mantras and, people.
Well, so that's the tough part, because I don't know a single human being who isn't affected in one degree or another by.
It's the amount, isn't it?
Well, I guess it is a matter of volume, I suppose, or
how many parts per million, get.
Yeah, exactly. Because because I can say for sure from my own life experience, I mean, looking at this and comparing it to my own experience, I go, okay, well, it is certainly true that I, Chris Shelton, grew up around Scientology, got very deeply involved in Scientology, did it for 27 years. And that whole time, I very definitely felt like I was on shaky ground when I was around other people who I perceived, especially in the world of Scientology, as older, wiser, more informed, more superior, or senior to me.
Having superpowers. That's
always one degree or another, yeah.
They were OT.
OTs, exactly. Because, well, there was that. There was always a certain degree of, well, can they read my mind?
Yeah. I better stop thinking about all those terrible things that they won't want me to be thinking about. Yeah.
That comes up every now and again, but that was much more of a fear for me in session. When I was on an e-meter, I was way more afraid of an e-meter reading my mind than I was just some OT walking about, right?
It's amazing.
So I can relate that statement about a pseudo self, or being on shaky ground, being uncertain, not knowing what mantras to believe and not, having that, even though I was telling myself the entire time that Scientology was the science of certainty, as L. Ron Hubbard explained it or defined it, and that that I was very, very certain about the principles of Scientology. Those were not uncertainties to me. I knew
Inviolable.
I understood them as well as I felt that could be understood. And I mean, we're talking about all the basic, you know, the tone scale, ARC triangle, all that stuff.
Space
So
is a viewpoint of dimension, all the really
yeah,
comprehensive.
all the stuff that you figure, you know, you work it around and you figure it out and you go, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah.
And if I buy into, you know, like the viewpoint and dimension thing, I mean, if you buy into the fact that this is all an illusion and we're all just creating it anyway, and we really don't, then none of this really even actually exists, really, like, and you really get down to it, right? It's all postulates and we're all just sort of creating this and it's all just sort of a game anyway, and ultimately none of this really means anything. Which I would do if you
However,
want,
using a tautology to describe it is not going to work any way around, is it? Space is a viewpoint of dimension.
well, that's the thing is once
Space
you
is a space of space. You see, it's the first definition of space that didn't use energy and mass. It only used space of space of space. It's like,
right, that's right.
It's
That's right.
like survive is the basic principle of all that exists. Everything that exists is existing. Is that what you're telling me?
Well,
Like,
it's
keep
something
breathing, keep breathing, keep breathing. Everybody is chanting space, particle, keep breathing, keep breathing. It's like,
yeah, it's pretty weird stuff. So admittedly, so I mean, I can see in hindsight that it was, you know, silly, and I get that. I think though that there might be a danger in a so-called objective, you know, third person looking in on, say, me or somebody else. Say somebody not so extreme, maybe some a religious believer, you know, just some run-of-the-mill Christian person. You could have people of various unfaiths, atheists, for example, right? People, militants, people who get pretty about, you know, if you don't show me physical evidence, then it doesn't exist, and God damn it, that's the way it is, right? You get these
or
guys,
God,
right?
not damn it, as the case
Yeah,
may be.
exactly, right? So
Not God,
somebody
damn it.
like that could read from, and this is what I'm asking, actually. I'm kind of trying to
Yeah,
see
yeah,
the thing,
please.
right? Could they read this and then go, oh, well, this believer right here, just by the fact of believing, because clearly I can see that's crazy. Clearly, this person is involved in some pseudo self. They can't make their own decisions. They were raised on religious indoctrination. Therefore,
Yeah,
you know, unwarranted conclusion A, B, and C based on certain facts. So how
from
do we,
response to it. From
yeah,
does
what is,
respond to idea. It,
okay,
in
cool.
The Heart of Man in 1964. That
Wow, it took him a few years to respond to that criticism.
well, look, it's taken you until now to provide it. You know, so
Well, you
um,
know, tell me about this stuff. So, but what's that? Yeah, what does he say about that?
in the Art of Loving, Erich Fromm talks about religious belief and differentiates it to say, of course, if that's a decision you made for yourself, you asked those questions, you thought those thoughts, and you arrived there because that's where you want to go. He has no problem. He also, however, defines, he talks about religion, he admits he's an atheist, and he says that as far as he's concerned, as long as God consists of love, truth, honorable behavior, what have you, a series of things, as long as that's the God that people believe in, a good God, he's with them. You know, it's fine. And so it doesn't interfere, you know, yourself. It doesn't mean you have to disagree with everything that's in the world. It means that you select what you agree and disagree with, so that if you're asked to vote for somebody on certain issues, then you'll think about the issues, you'll think about the person involved, you'll see what's out there, you'll weigh the evidence up, and you'll come to your own conclusion. Otherwise, you'll ask the guy next to you at the bar, who are you going to vote for? And you'll vote for that person. Now, there's a lot of, I'm in this group, we believe this, we do this, we go along with this. The point is that it's not a Republican or Democrat thing. I'm still convinced that there are people of integrity in the Republican Party and people of integrity in the Democrat Party. Sadly, there are also a lot of corrupt people in the swamp,
Right.
which Donald Trump has not been draining very well these last 3 years. You know, like I would like to have seen the CIA people responsible for the torture yoked out personally, and leaving them there was him and Obama both did it though. So bad people.
Those are decisions that are made um, above their pay grade.
Yeah, yeah,
Or at least outside of those circles. It's interesting seeing the relationship between a 4 or 8 year term president and the career bureaucrats that exist in the State Department, DOJ, various government
and
executive
individuals
branch.
like Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney who were just there for years.
Yeah.
You know, through
Yeah.
the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, into the second Bush administration,
Right.
until, you know, as the film Vice shows, Cheney just takes over.
That's right.
You know, ha ha. Here
Exactly.
I am the face of evil. You know.
Right. And exactly. I watched that too. Learned a lot
Yeah.
out of it actually. So yeah, so you get that kind of thing where presidents are kind of told how it is rather than the ones calling the shots. On certain things, in certain instances, I think that's the case, that it's just sort of, no, this is what we're doing. This is the long-term intention and goal and objective here. This is why we have to do this. Yes, we understand it has this, you know, this public problem and there's an image problem and all that, but this is the justification for why we're doing it. And whatever that justification or set of justifications are, it convinces these presidents that they need to leave it alone. Yeah. And I don't know, I can imagine what arguments are being made. You know, you watch the report, you see some of what's being talked about, but I don't know that that's the convincing argument that turns the president, you know, but somehow that happens. And it's interesting because you wonder what other things are there we don't know about where that also happens.
Well, it's all about the oranges of the thinking of the president, I think. Once you understand the oranges of Donald Trump's thinking, then you can get down to the oranges, then you can understand exactly what's informing him. He is finding out the oranges of things and telling us, or as his niece has said, was it Mary Trump, whenever a word has passed his lips, he believes it.
Exactly. That's a great way of putting it. That's a great way of putting it.
It's really weird when you do know you've got a maverick there. You've got a guy who really is acting without advice. He's
yep.
You know, his own closest people. How many has he thrown out? Now about 27 of his close advisors in the last 2 weeks. Who know, you know, that because he just does what he feels like doing, which is the best thing about him. It's the only good thing about him, that he's totally transparent. You can see he's exactly who he is from what he says. You know, beautiful, clean,
that is
cold.
true. It is just difficult because you know, because he's also somebody who seems, actually, let me modify that. Because I agree with you that an independent attitude as a president is vital, actually, and it is a refreshing quality to see as somebody who is unbridled by, you know, obligation and debt and agreements, deals, and all this other stuff. My problem with how Trump utilizes that independent attitude is that he doesn't seem to understand what his briefers are telling him, and that's my concern. It's more so than I think I've even said I'd feel more comfortable if he was a man of principle and I knew what those principles were, so I could, you know, because then you can sort of predict the behavior. And with him, he's a little unpredictable, you know, he's a little all over the place until you twig on, oh, he thinks about the world like a mob boss does. Then things start, then the principles, because everybody's really a person of principle. It's just a matter of figuring out what they are. And with him, those principles are very, very, very different from politicians. They have a whole different thing going on. So it is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the guy who ghost wrote one of his autobiographies said that he said to him that there are predators and there are prey. That's how the world works. And you will meet something like this idea in sociology. You can meet something like this idea in sociology. But the point is there are also non-predators and non-prey. And when we switch that around, the authoritarian attitude is the predator's attitude. And the reason that the predator can be the top of the eating tree is because they can command a majority of people who will side with them because of their divine right or their inheritance or their some reason that's got nothing to do with the people below them understanding who they are and deciding that that would be a good person to lead. I'm not against the notion of leadership. I'm against the notion of authoritarianism. And I am totally for the idea of accountability. I think most politicians should be hung at the end of their second term. It's only fair, and it would be a deterrent to future politicians.
Anybody ever becoming a politician?
You see, this is a win-win situation.
Right.
Anarchy in the UK. But the idea that authoritarianism transfers just into a way of believing that if we look at the dependent personality disorder, which is meant to only affect, I don't know, a couple of percent of people, I think, that we're extending that to say, no, that might be 60% of people. Jane McGregor at Nottingham University wrote a book about it, the sociopath, empath, apath triad, or SEAT.
Oh, right.
And the apath's the difficult bit, but that's your 60%. That's your people who will go along with the sociopathic people in culture, and that's not just the psychopaths, that's all of the types. They'll go along with them. They will assist them in harming the empaths, very much like Ron Hubbard's suppressive person concept, but skewed at a different angle. That for Hubbard, of course, the antisocial personality, as he called it, as of course does the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of the APA, American Psychiatric Mob, that the sentence finishes itself.
Exactly.
I'm just being snarky about Ron Hubbard again.
Yeah, I know. It's easy. It's not hard to do.
Well, I think he wanted to be remembered, and I'm all for that. That was his goal, to be remembered, and I'm glad to have facilitated that. I think he should be remembered, so that at night mothers can say to their children, "If you don't go to sleep now, L. Ron Hubbard will come and get you."
You're right, exactly.
Expect to sleep.
That's right. Well, I'm willing to certainly consider the numbers being thrown around there. I mean, 60%. You can kind of go, okay, let me reframe my image of society and look at this and go, okay. I mean, we also look at maybe this is the percentage of people, or maybe there's some other thing going on here when we layer propaganda on top of that. How many people are susceptible to it? Who isn't? But why? Because I think everybody's susceptible to it. It's just a matter of getting the right buttons pushed. Right.
Parts per million. We can become. That's where in our Wrote Open Minds that I started with a story about very nearly being scammed on a computer thing, within an inch of my life. And that to say it doesn't matter how long you do this for. And I've been consciously, I think that any study of Scientology is a primer. As long as you understand what you've actually learned, it's a great primer. And some of the elements of it are true, like the idea of third partying called triangulation elsewhere. Yes, these things happen. The suppressive person, yes, indeed, there are antisocial personalities, and they're very visible. When you look to Hubbard's set of criteria, they're kind of skewed. Not liking Ron Hubbard, not liking Scientology. These are evidently traits of an antisocial personality.
Top of the list. Yeah. Top of the list traits. If those two things are true, the rest of them automatically are true.
I shall have no other God before me.
That's right.
Decreed, yeah.
That's right. Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that these percentages, this view of society, I feel like if I was going to write a book, it would be called A Certain Percentage, because I always say that. A certain percentage of people, blah, 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 blah. Well, I feel obviously very safe saying that because it's true.
Lots of people say it.
Yeah, it's going to be true that a certain percent, whether that certain percent is 0.0001% or 90%, that's the question. And I don't know. And I don't know that we have accurate information to even be able to assess. I just don't know. Maybe we do. Maybe this is all figured out. But
well, the Milgram number is taken from the first. I think he did 17 experiments in the series, changing the parameters, making it less and less likely. And actually, the numbers do go down a little bit. And in later studies, they can go down quite a lot. It depends who you believe. But he found that 60% of people would go through to the XXX voltage on the machine. 100% of people were willing to shock other people. Everyone in the first experiment. Now you'll find a few resistant people, but I don't think, again, there's a 2080 is one of the other numbers that if you show the gorillas playing ping pong, that 80% of people won't notice because they've been told to count the ball. The number of times that net goes over the net, they don't notice that two of the players have been substituted with guys in gorilla suits.
Right.
20% of people, however, do see it. I only see it because whenever I see people playing table tennis, I'm waiting for one of them to have a gorilla suit on because I've seen Darren Brown.
That's right. Or there's the other meme about the guys playing basketball and then a gorilla guy walks.
Or a naked woman in some versions of it.
Yeah, and you just don't even see it. Even see it.
No.
Well, let me ask you this though, because since we're on this,
I would see the naked woman too, if that's your question.
Of course you would. No, but also, and since you bring up the Milgram and I guess we could go to Asch conformity as well, you have. This is one of those things where I've sort of thrown this out there. Let me know what you think of this. I believe that, or the way I see how we think or how we act, I see that you end up having a genetic or evolutionary, whether it's social or individual, some trait comes along and is developed through time, I suppose. And the fact that we can form structural hierarchies, social hierarchies, is a fairly important thing we can do, right? It's not exclusive to humans, but it allows us to have groups in society, and we form the most advanced social hierarchies, as I understand it, on the planet in terms of animals and creatures and all that sort of thing.
Well, unless it really is the dolphins who are running it all by telepathy, of course.
Yeah, exactly, and that's true. That's true. That's the blue whales. So, so short of that. I think because we have that ability or trait, we have this reverse thing that can happen too. Like there's a positive and a negative to almost all of these traits that we develop. We develop we develop frontal lobes so that we can rationally justify or reason through things. Well,
use ourselves proficiently.
Exactly, right? We can, the plus side is we can make shit, we can invent stuff, we can innovate things, we can think thoughts through at a very, very advanced level compared to other creatures on this planet, not compared to, say, computers, but, we're pretty good. But the reverse side of that is we engage in logical fallacies. We can believe two mutually exclusive things at the same time that cannot be true, yet we can do it. So because we have these frontal lobes and this ability to reason and rationale through things, and critical thinking, we also have illogical thinking. Both of these things exist at the same time, two sides of the same coin. Here, I'm gonna throw out with the social hierarchies or with these experiments, what we see is 80% of people will go along with authority is one way you could frame that. The other way you could frame that is 80% of people are cooperative with a social hierarchy. And 20% aren't. They're like, nope, I don't want to be part of your hierarchy. I ain't
interested. The social hierarchy says nothing changed. There were no men in gorilla suits. It is the problem. It's more the problem of the teaching the observer that if we could change that percentage, if we could, wherever it actually lies, even if only 1% of people are utterly compliant, there are degrees, and that it's not a sort of two-dimensional thing. That it's not just a black and white scale. There are degrees of color. There are different shadings that I think often when we start trying to look at traits, I looked at the Levinson Scale, which I think everybody should take the Levinson Scale. I only found it the other day. It's a test for psychopathy or sociopathy, and you can assess yourself as how bad you are.
Oh yeah, I think I've seen this.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't seem to have the tautologies that you find in the hare, where hare's doubling the value of certain traits by putting a second question that asks the same thing. But which is fair enough. If he does want, probably did think about it. He's a very bright man. But it was interesting to go through it and say, these are the traits that are considered to be sociopathic, rather than ticking off 8 or 10 of them and saying, right, the person's a sociopath. Why not tick off those 8 and 10 and say they have these traits? They do precisely these things. What can we do about that? Right? You know, what can we do about any one of those things? And usually with sociopathy, if the person is intelligent enough and they're not held to be any psychopaths, sociopaths, any more or less intelligent than the general population. So you get all sorts, you really do. You get thugs who are really not very bright, and you get, you know, university professors and politicians and lawyers and judges and, you know, top people all over our wonderful society who are in fact predators by design. They're not benign narcissists, which is how Fromm would define that 60%. He doesn't actually add those two things together, though he's the guy that gave us the malignant narcissist and therefore the benign narcissist. And if you add his pseudo self together, what he says about the narcissist is they're a person who doesn't have a self. That's it.
Right.
It's not because they love themselves. They don't know what love is, so they can't create a self, which is the next level of his, this rather clever way of talking about how people feel better by being able to express love, by creating a self where you're making the decisions about how you do or don't interact with the world around you, and how you do or don't collaborate with the people around you. Not at any point denying collaboration. Collaboration is the fundament of human achievement. Without society, there'd be, well, we'd be living in the trees, making their nest every night like the other chimps do, you know.
That's right. That's right. Well, and that's the whole thing about the social psychology and evolution, social evolution. I got to read this guy because I really do want to understand exactly what he's saying about some of this, because I have gone back and forth on this. You know, I was talking to Melissa the other night about thinking about how well, I was thinking about some of these quotes that I've heard you say, or things that I've heard other people talk about with narcissism and ego. And I got to thinking about ego, and I was thinking, I don't think this is a fully formed thought. I'm just sort of, thinking out loud a little bit here, but it's sort of, they talk about how narcissists love themselves. They're all about themselves. It's all about me, right? No. And I'm guessing Fromm is taking some other approach with this, because I started thinking, well, what if it wasn't that? What if there was a vacuum inside of self-image? Exactly. And they needed constant reinforcement of, who they are, how great they are, how wonderful they are, because they know deep inside that they are, an insignificant, tiny, little scared child who's never really, come out of that.
The majority of them are vulnerable. The majority of them, Donald Trump, when he came back, having found there weren't 1 million tickets sold, with his tie slumped down, the vulnerable narcissist will collapse. Hubbard did it frequently. I spoke with so many people over the years who'd seen him crying and saying he was worthless and all of this kind of stuff while drunk, or whatever.
That's right. Well, I wonder about that, because I also, what you see sometimes with, there's a story about a very famous musician who had performed for decades. This is not a new guy, been around forever. I won't say his name because I just want to kind of paint the picture here of this very, very famous, everybody would know his name immediately if I said it, musician who was surprised, who a friend of his was relating this story, or a person who had looked up to him was relating this story on a talk show about how they went backstage and the guy was sniveling, like crying, collapsed mess out in the green room prior to the concert. Crowd of people, packed house, completely sold out venue. And this guy was in the green room before the show, freaking out that nobody was going to like him and that it was going to be a disaster. And he was just convinced, he was absolutely convinced that he was going to go out there and make a complete fool out of himself. This is a guy who'd been on stage for like 20 plus years, had been in band, done solo, done everything, right? So you hear about it, you hear stories like that, and you just go, Jesus Christ, I guess I'm not alone in this self-doubt and self-recrimination and other things that go on in my head sometimes. And that's what makes me think to myself, who is this self-reliant, certain, self-certain person that Fromm is talking about? Because I don't think I've met that person yet.
Well, it's self-certain that I think it's an attitude of mind, and I don't think he's talking about, you know, some. You, you, I mean, today I was talking with my dear friend Pamela, and the topic came up um, um, of imposter syndrome, which I
Yep.
understand from reading about it in the 80s as feeling that the people around you are imposters. But it has now absolutely come to mean feeling that you yourself are an imposter. One of the
Yeah.
problems with the definition of the thing is that any sane person will at times have twinges of being undeserving. Any,
Yep.
you know, that's a, you know, so it's not about that. You know, Fromm comes
Okay.
with a set of ways of saying, okay, well, if you were a grown up, and that's not the way he expresses it, it's the way I'm going to express it, then um, you would be able to deal with the world around you by thinking about what was going on, by making decisions. You wouldn't be blown along, you know, just doing what the nice guy in the suit told you to do. You wouldn't be, you know, your life wouldn't be consumed. In fact, in Scientology terms, you're becoming self-determined. That doesn't mean that you won't be influenced by the world around you, but it does mean that where conclusions are to be drawn, you will draw them. You'll say,
Okay.
I choose to believe this, I choose not to believe that. You will be in charge of those things. What Fromm says about narcissism is Freud apparently brings the term into psychology for the first time. And he says you're born with core narcissism, you're a primary narcissist when you're born. With a lot of expensive therapy over many years, we can get you to secondary narcissism. That is the next stage. Narcissism means you love yourself. Fromm says no. Narcissism means you don't know how to love. So you certainly don't love yourself. And exactly as you say, there's a vacuum where the self should be being made.
Right.
This is a
And that,
person.
see, that makes a lot more sense as an interpretation to me,
Mm,
based on the monster factories that narcissists, malignant narcissists specifically, are raised in.
yeah.
Because I don't believe that it's a, you know, in nature or nurture. I believe that
Those
it is.
things are working there all
Yeah, I
the
think
time.
it's going to be a combination of these
All
things, but I think you're going to have certain genetic proclivities or certain genetic tendencies. That's how genetics works. But you know, and a family will pass on traits that, you know, continue a narcissistic line. But I do believe that it has a tremendous amount to do with how you are raised, in what environment you are raised in, how you are dealt with, how you are told to think of yourself. You know, I had the childhood indoctrination, and we know, you know, carrying on the conversation about Trump, but we would really be talking about any of these malignant narcissist authoritarian types. And on the scale of, you know, of Hitler's and Mao's, Trump is actually kind of low on the scale. He's not really.
so
Yeah,
far, so
well,
far. If he gets another
yeah,
term, he's
well,
going to go past 600,000 to beat Abe Lincoln as the president with the most deaths of Americans during his time.
uh,
But
uh,
with the
but,
COVID-19,
but he
very
was.
sadly, the numbers are climbing. You know, so
I know. I'm not trying to be a Trump
sorry,
apologist here when I
no,
say
no, no.
that those are
Forgive
not
me.
violent deaths in war that he brought about. So you know, so I kind of go, okay, well, true enough. But what I mean by that is I have never seen Trump having aspirations of world domination or world control or even societal control in America to the degree that you see a Mao or a Stalin or a
No,
Xi.
they are this super
Oh yeah, these
human
guys are they're
ubermensch. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, the
nobody. Mao is just the most
holy
evil
shit,
man who
these
ever
guys.
lived, and there's
Oh,
still great portraits of him being worshipped around China. But 70 million people, possibly.
yeah, exactly. Now see, here was the thing. 4 years ago, I wasn't so sure.
Mm.
Right. And this feeds to back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of the show.
Yeah.
You know, we are unsure of what we're looking at. And unfortunately, any student of history quickly learns, I believe, I certainly feel like I learned this lesson, that when you're in the middle of it, you got no perspective.
Yeah.
So you can only relate, you know, what's happening in real time to incidents in the past of a similar nature and go, well, this could be that. Or this could be something of a completely different nature. And until you let time pass and contextualize and frame it into the flow of history, you can't really know. And so we're all freaked out because we see these red flags that appear to be very similar to earlier red flags in time when drastically horrible things happened. And we go, well, is this that? Well, 4 years ago, I couldn't tell. What I saw in Trump was a narcissist, an uncaring man who was me before everybody. And recognizing those traits from L. Ron Hubbard, I went, nope, this ain't the guy. We don't want this. And of course, a certain percentage of people didn't listen, and so we got it. And now we're 4 years later, and I get to now, with the benefit of hindsight, say, well, I can see why I said what I said, and I still stand by what I said given the knowledge I had at the time. But now I can look at it 4 years after the fact and go, okay, I get how I misinterpreted certain red flags and thought that they were, a clarion call for something much more horrible than it was. And I'll say that. I'll say, yeah, of course, time and experience give you more clarity and context, and you can kind of, oh, okay, I get it now. But at the time, how are we supposed to know? And were those red flags really not red flags? No, they were definitely red flags. They still are. So I only want to put that out there to sort of like, not to say that this is not about me engaging in apologia for Trump, but given the time and context that we've gotten now, I now get to scale him in a different way than I did 4 years ago. And I think that's one of the things that makes this information difficult, is that we are given these red flags, we're given this information as to why people act the way they do and what authoritarianism is and how it works. But at the end of the day, it's still, oh God, is that really what this red flag shows right now? Or is this just noise and distraction, or just so much non sequitur nonsense? Is it being blown out of proportion even? Hard to say, and that's where I struggle these days in trying to interpret the events of the world against the knowledge base that I have. How do you deal with that? Because I'm very curious and open to suggestions here as to how to think about the world these days in light of all the data we have.
Well, I think that the first thing is the quality of the data, and that does mean that if there's a serious question, you are going to go and have to look at a paper that somebody's written about it somewhere. There'll be some, god awful thing somewhere. Yeah. And there'll then probably be something counter to that paper, and away you go down the rabbit hole. But some things do seem to add up. We talked about the Solomon Asch, where you put three lines together and a group of shills basically pretend that the lines are the same or different lengths to see if the eighth person to come into the room will agree with them. And a huge number of people scored positively on this in American colleges in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Almost 400 studies, I think, were done, because it's not difficult to do, right? So 400 individual
experiment to run, yeah.
Nearly 400 people who were engineers, maths or science students. I think there was only one of them that agreed.
Right.
And there is this general idea that in fact compliance is going down rather than up, that the society is getting closer to maybe 50% compliance than it was, which means that some of what's being talked about has actually had an impact, that there are thoughts out there now that are making people pull short. I think that focusing on the notion of authoritarianism, where, I believe you should be king because you are obviously sent by God. You can tell by the beard and the sandals, which we know are under there, with the little hairy hobbit toes in them, but oh, that was definitely worth it. We're going to have to see those toes at some point.
Oh yeah.
That somebody is believed in because for why? Because they say they're a nice person, because they've got a lovely mustache that you can barely see as it gets paler with age. Why should I grant that authority to anyone or anything? Even if I were to believe in God, then I would be in dialogue with God, accepting that God, as the creator of the entire universe, would be, you know, somewhat out of my league. You know,
Think,
whoa.
I agree with that completely. In that, if there were a God, if I believed in this living entity that I thought had actual physical reality or some supernatural reality outside of space and time, sure, I could imagine having, ways and means in which you could have a personal relationship with such an entity. But I just keep thinking to myself, given my nature, understanding the nature of life as it is, a human life here on planet Earth, I can't even imagine that that some entity that is constructed in any way like us would stick around for millions and millions and millions of years to
Billions of
hear
years.
about
Yeah.
how you
Oh,
want to win the football game this week.
maybe they've got a fast forward though.
Yeah, yeah, they have a fast forward button. Let's skip through all these dinosaurs. This is the boring part. I don't care about how the conch shell develops. So, yeah, fast forward, right? Let's get
All
to
right, there are the interesting bits. The
That's right.
humans, look, they're fun, aren't
Ah,
they?
people. Let's look at them for a while, because they are clearly the height of life in this universe right here. This is it. This is as good as it gets, right?
100 billion
So,
stars in. Now somebody's saying there are a trillion galaxies. This is one has been floated from the usual 100 billion up to trillion.
well, once you start thinking with an infinite universe, I suppose anything is possible numbers wise. But Jesus fucking
I don't
Christ,
think with an infinite anything. It's like,
yeah.
beyond. I met a man once who said he'd been in he'd taken himself to a mental hospital simply because he was trying to figure out the problem of infinity. He was about 20 at the time.
Huh.
And may have gone south from there, who knows. But and I just looked at him and it's like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
So
if you're going to look for answers on that, take yourself down to the math department. Why take yourself down to the psych area,
yeah, and learn what an imaginary number is and get your head around that in maths.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
Yeah.
Let's go have some interesting conversations with people down in the physics department about, theoretical physics and quanta and stuff. That'll get ideas of infinity out of your head real quick, because you'll be much more confused about these other things.
Yeah. Get some packets of superstrings and dip them in some dark energy and wave them around in some dark.
Exactly. Exactly.
With your Higgs boson creating everything, giving it mass, giving particles mass. Hang on a minute. What were the particles before they got mass? This is getting a bit scary.
All right. Well, let me go back to something earlier, because
yes.
I want to bring this up again. I'd like to highlight this a little bit, because I'm wondering about this, and I'm wondering about the framing of this, and that is this conformity thing. Okay, so conformity is over time appears to be, at least under certain contexts, diminishing. We see a change in the results in this thing.
Instant compliance. Yeah.
That's right. The compliance experiments. Okay. We can look at that, and we can paint that in a good light. We can paint that in a bad light. And I'm kind of looking right now at the bad light side, because I'm like, okay, we think this is good. We will have less instant compliance and conformity. But how is that going to factor in when certain situations that you want positive instant compliance in come up? I mean, can this go too far, do you think?
I think you have to separate out what those forms are. In a war, during an insurrection, when there's violence on the streets, you probably do need warriors to, whatever you call them, when a fire breaks out, you need warriors to go and deal with it.
That's right.
That's a reality. As long as we are not transnational in our beliefs, as long as we don't believe ourselves for all of humanity, there will always be the danger of war. And it's my point of view that, to the extent that there are nations, which seems to be a pretty fluid term when you look at what happens in the middle of Europe and where things belong to and when, when Czechoslovakia created somewhere about 1923 or something, splits in two to become Slovakia and the Czech Republic in the 90s, and then you've got Bohemia's in there somewhere, and all sorts of things. The Sudetenland, remember the Sudetenland? Oh, that was a dangerous place, certainly for the 4 million German speakers who lived there. Um, yeah, authority and the nature of authority in our world. For me, the notion of authoritarianism is it's become the central notion, and only in the last couple of years, I used the word cult along with everybody else, and eventually I got bored defending it. It's a perfectly good, serviceable word. Its etymology was shifted in American dictionaries in the late 19th century with no real reason, except there are a huge amount of crackpot cults going on in the US in that period, the last decade after the Civil War. Everything goes crazy. The modern world is invented in that place, with all the PTSD of the, hundreds of thousands of millions of people who'd experienced war in the most horrible form, in the most brutal form ever. The first metal war, where there are metal ships and repeater rifles, machine guns,
Gatling guns. That's right. All of that invented during that time period.
All for the greatest man. But I think that there is the fundamental objective of governments is really defense, as you can't control the economy. I think we found that out. I think we found that monetarism is just going to screw a country up. Look at Russia and the Yeltsin, look how successful monetarism was there. And that was straight from the source, monetarism. It wasn't like Margaret Thatcher's watered down monetarism. It was what the man himself said. And while Keynes has, very interesting things to say, and there are ways of looking at things, it's an art, it's not a science. This idea that you could predict, the idea that we've still got hedge funds out there, subprimes are still being sold, still being traded. Because it's a balance. As long as you don't have too many subprimes, there's no danger of the market collapsing. So you've got to watch how many you've got now.
I thought they got subprimes. I thought there were other new sticky thorns and nonsense they were getting into. But
there are things that add up to the same thing, that people who won't be able to repay our lent money when the people lending to them know that they're going to get the property back to sell on. It's the same mistake that was made before the Great Depression. It's what brought it on, the collapse in prices, because the banks were going, oh, well, we'll repossess if you can't pay. And suddenly all these farms are available for rent or hire, and no takers, no farmers. The farmers have all been bankrupted. So,
exactly, a little bit of a silly situation there.
Yeah.
But what about this business I'm bringing up of authoritarianism? Bad for sure, but we can push too far and end up breaking apart the order of things. And I'm talking about it in an ultimate sense, of course. I mean, I'm talking about over a long period of time, if we have this diminishing percentage of people who are willing to conform to authority, well, that's fine in terms of the overreach of authority. But what about, when we're talking about the structure of a society, a family, a company, et cetera, and, oh, that's all bad, that's all bad, that's all bad.
Well,
I think we might go too far.
Put it in terms of authority in a family. But when a baby is born, he or she is completely helpless.
Yes.
So the point is raising that human being from the point of helplessness to the point of independence, from dependence to independence, and in a full maturity to interdependence, to realizing that no man is an island, and nor is a woman either, by the way, just in case anybody was going to take offense at that. Quite right too. No person is an island. Let's rewrite. It was John Donne or somebody, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was. And then there was the
I Am a Rock, I Am an Island by Paul Simon.
That's it,
yeah,
Simon.
Paul Simon, endure. But he wasn't. He married Carrie Fisher, and it's the child of my first marriage, as he says, going to Graceland. So married Carrie Fisher. He was a very, very intelligent woman.
Yes.
I'll certainly say that, and a little bit odd. But it's what, Postcards from the Edge, that she wrote that, I think, the movie. So I could check it and find it's got nothing to do with her. It's just typically just trying to drop a name and look important as usual. But for me, that authoritarianism, just as a notion, it's like we'd like to be democratic. We'd like to have consensus. It doesn't mean everybody votes on every issue. It doesn't have to be a plebiscite referendum democracy. It means that everybody has a say. So things like Virtual Taiwan, where they discuss on the internet how they might adapt policy. So with electric scooters, I think we talked about this before, they were 50-50 against. They got to a 2/3, a supermajority, by talking about, well, protective gear, speed they go at, insurance, this kind of thing. And they got a majority that said, yep, with these conditions. Not everything can be negotiated that way. War can't be negotiated that way. You know, somebody's attacking you, you don't go and have a conversation with everybody in the country about whether you ought to defend yourself and how. You know, you have to just do it. In emergency situations, you have to have authority. But just as a child hopefully grows to maturity to be able to be independent, if you had a society where the vast majority of people, say 2/3 of people, were independent in their thinking, and that most of those people, all but the 2% are psychopaths, would seek interdependence, would understand that we become something not by being individual souls, but by being part of the network of relationship that we're alive in, and that we actually, through our minds, live within. You know, we live partly in the world, but very much, I think, in our relationships, our moods, you know, how we feel about ourselves and what we're doing. A lot of that's to do with, you know, the Buddha said that you know, you should have people around you who are of like mind, and Oliver Wendell Holmes said something about superior people like himself ought to form clubs of genius, you know, which if he was around,
his humility was his best quality.
Yeah. Well, as Donald Trump says in Think Like a Champion, one of the things people don't know about him is how humble he is.
Yeah.
And that's true. That is one of the things.
It's his best kept secret. Yes, that is true.
Is it an unknown known or a known unknowable, as Don Rumsfeld would probably have it? It's just, it's wild. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right about that.
Thank you.
Well, no, I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, in terms of, no, not about Donald Trump. I mean, in terms of you know, in emergency situations, yes, very much so. Or in certain contexts, we really appreciate it. We really like it. We want it. There are service providers there are services the government provides, rather, that we want to have run by the government. We want them doing that. We like the concept of Social Security. The last few generations have really dug that. We think that's a good idea. We want that to continue. But that requires an authority figure. That's not a communal thing, right? Somebody has to make that happen. Defense is definitely a thing. I think that there is I wanted to ask you about this last thing too, and then I'm going to have to go today. But I wanted to ask you about this because I'm really curious about your opinion on it. There was a little comedy, not maybe a comedy short. Anyway, somebody sent me a little video the other day that was British, and it was about a guy I think it was a show, and it was this guy explaining to the Prime Minister why this progressive program was not really a very good idea, and that it was in fact ludicrous and was never going to happen, and he really needed to stop pushing it. And it was a very matter-of-fact kind of conversation from this more, you know, he was one of the more like we were talking about earlier, the bureaucrat, the decades-long bureaucrat versus the, you know, PM, the prime minister of the moment, or, you know, or whatever. And this guy was explaining, you know, in a very matter-of-fact way, that the purpose of government wasn't to do all these wonderful, nice social things for people. The purpose of government is to keep order.
Stop the masses from revolting.
Keep order is how he put it.
Yeah.
And I didn't particularly get a flavor from him of stop revolts in terms of, like, you know, suppress or oppress the masses. This was a person who was explaining this this is just kind of how this works. This wasn't a nefarious thing. This was... You've got
to have a defense against gangs and warlords in a society, I believe. We are far more effective at that than most places in the world. In the UK, we have a very low crime rate. Holland generally has about the lowest in Europe, but that's because they're all smoking dope all the time. They're too lazy to go out and burgle anybody.
Right.
What could I say? You know,
I think you're probably right about that. Because I'll tell you, if you are on pot, the last thing you want to do is go rob somebody. I will definitely say that is...
I just put that at the bottom of the list, Chris. Yeah, no, the last thing, right?
That's right.
The other two things.
Yeah,
that's
you are
the last thing on my list.
Not going to be interested. Um, okay, so but I think, of course, that if you reduce it down to something that's simple or simplistic, that you open the door to some pretty authoritarian thinking. I mean, if the purpose of government is to keep order, well, everybody in their homes, locked up and all that is very orderly. So, so it could obviously be taken the wrong way. What do you think about that in terms of right way, wrong way, anyway? What is that at all a function of government, or do you believe the defense thing you mentioned earlier is pretty much its key purpose and everything
Well,
else?
it's defense against outside and inside influences. I do believe, I've had the good fortune to meet police officers who were thoroughly honourable, decent people who do their job. And, there's a guy in the two guys I met in the armed police locally, and they, they were decent human beings. No two ways about it. They were not thugs. They were not sort of people who'd be harming other people. And they're the elite, which, because very few cops carry guns in this country. Nottingham, Manchester, and London, I think, are still the only three places where we have armed police. It might have spread a bit further as the years have progressed. I'm sure Spike will find out for us. But I've also met police officers who are thoroughly and utterly corrupt, in their thinking, in their morality, who would be willing to plant something to get somebody incriminated, and indeed who have, and people who are just incompetent. I met quite a lot of those. The point is that the really good cops are among the most valuable of people in society. The really good soldiers. I spent some time with a guy who'd been in the Special Boat Squadron, which is the Navy here's equivalent of Navy SEALs, I suppose, or the Special Air Squadron, the SAS. They're the high performance people. And I never really thought about it before. I grew up near a barracks. I was an army cadet for a couple of years when I was in school, so I had some familiarity with army ways. But they're just taken into this way of being, where they become someone. Your thought is, the thought on the outside, the kind of hippie thought is they're pigs, they're, these bad people. This guy was very much that he wanted to defend people. And when he walked down the street, he was a physical instruction guy in a very high quality regiment. So he was built like an Iron Man, a literal, actual, huge sort of big, strong person. And when he walked down the street, you saw the local terrorists peeling off the walls ahead of him. I've never been with anybody that did this before. And he wasn't looking at them. He was just walking down the street. But he emanated such a presence of physical power, and he was upright, that old word for people being righteous. And he was righteous. He was a good guy. But to see, to meet somebody, he spent, I think, 11 years in the forces by that time. And he had the right motive. And to get into a position where you think there could be a society without cops, without soldiers, and without the right to say you have to do something immediately. There's a hostage situation. Somebody needs to go and save somebody, or an ambulance needs to pick somebody up. The fire needs to be put out. Those things they can't go through a series of votes that take 6 months.
Exactly.
But everything that the smaller government can be, the better. I would absolutely say that the smaller government can be. That Switzerland has this very interesting canton system where they send very few representatives, so they have a government almost of a cabinet. And I mean, we have government by cabinet. I think it's one of the bad things in the US that the president has his own coterie around him, who are not necessarily really politicians. They're just cronies. They're just mates, and they reinforce the opinion. Whereas you get a more sort of professional political class in this country, that the people will understand how it all works and what they're meant to do. And it does seem, it's like politics, diplomacy, business, charity. These are all sectors of our, the arts economy that are run in quite different ways.
Exactly. Actually, you bring up a really good point, which of course is that the executive here in America, executive branch, has grown far beyond, I believe, the thoughts and dreams of what the founding fathers thought when they set the three parties, you know, not three party,
It
but three.
doesn't work. The balance doesn't exist. There have to be checks on all three of those things, and it
And
makes
there are.
yeah,
Well,
the
there are.
extent to which they work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that you've got this part of the government which is not lawmaking. It is law enforcing, it is policy making, it is foreign relations, it is State Department, it is domestic issues, you know, Homeland Defense, etc., Homeland Security. Huge. I mean, it's just gotten gigantic. It's the bulk of the government. I mean, the Supreme Court's this tiny little thing over here, and Congress is a few hundred folks and all their support staff, so a couple thousand people, I suppose. And then, I mean, even if we really blow it out of proportion and say there's 10,000 people, it's still nothing compared to the executive division, right? The executive branch. So it's an interesting problem there, and I think you make a good point about how, you know, where you really want the authority is where it has to be authority, where it has to be now. But otherwise, why are we doing it that way? Maybe we shouldn't do it that way. Maybe that requires a second look at some of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So
and
that's
the social security system, the idea of universal basic income, which Spain has now adopted. So we'll see that where it's been trialed in Finland, in Alaska, and Canada, the results have been too short but positive, largely in terms of not spending money on mental health. That the poor people who are not now terrified that they're going to be thrown off their benefits no longer need the large payments to the health service to maintain them. That people are happier when they know that they're not going to be, you know, pressured all the time. And you take off the whole machinery that's come in with that. The majority of state employees, you know, are military, or, you know, depending where you live, here they're not military, or they're hospital staff, or they're, you know, teachers, or they're, you know, they're whatever. And it's important. I think you can assess a country. It's like it's said that America has 50 times per capita the amount of lawyers to Japan.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
Not surprise me at all.
Because in Japan, of course, you can go to the accuser will offer you somebody to serve the sentence, and you just sign them off. So still, but you have more fish to fry. And,
I do. I have to get going. I've got another interview I have to get to. But this has been a great talk. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. And it's really interesting to just put a subject out in front of somebody, you know, and reflect, and see where they go to, you know, to integrate. Or I'm going to do a series of conversations with Yuval about Fromm's books, and he's already pointing out, look, this is wrong. We know this is not true. And I'm saying, yes, this is what we need to do. We need to go through this stuff and find out what's useful, because I think it is very useful. Anyway, it's been a supreme pleasure, and we'll talk again soon, Chris.
Awesome, man.
Cheers,
Talk
man.
to you.
Cheers, bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Keep breathing, keep breathing, keep breathing.